Well, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Leon Stefania, who invited me to take part in this conference, and also to present a preliminary lecture. I would also like to thank the members of program and organization committees for making this conference possible and for preparing a very interesting program. Okay. The reason why I'm here, Helen already explained, is related to the research I've been carrying out since 2019. During several months of that year, a group of researchers from the Institute of Musicology of the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Belgrade initiated a very exhausting exploration of archival documents preserved at the Archives of Yugoslavia, which consisted of making photographs of the content of more than 80 registers of the Fund of the Musical Youth of Yugoslavia, covering the period between 1959 and 1991. Approximately 24,000 pages of documents were copied, which was followed with their detailed examination and preparation of provisional descriptive list in order to enable subsequent research phases to be conducted as efficiently as possible. This was undoubtedly one of the most important tasks in the process of collecting of the data on musical youth of Yugoslavia's activities from the late 1950s to the beginning of the 1990s, and it was a prerequisite for initiating and completing other research steps. The whole process lasted for 3 months and would certainly not be done as neatly and promptly without great efforts of Dr. Marija Golubović, Dr. Vanja Grbović, Dr. Bojana Radovanović, and myself. As some of you may know, by the end of 2023, after many delays and pauses, which were the result of challenges imposed by COVID-19 pandemic, the collective volume titled Art for Pioneers, Young Workers and Brigadiers on the activities of the musical youth of Yugoslavia was published with 9 separate case studies written by 10 researchers, mainly from the Institute of Musicology, but also from the Music Academy of the University of Sarajevo, Faculty of Music of the University of Niš, Faculty of Arts of the University of Ljubljana, Music Academy of the University of Pula, etc. This volume served as a starting point for today's lecture, but it also inspired broader research of early post-Second World War Yugoslav cultural policy and its theoretical grounding that I've started in May this year. The preliminary results of this research will also be presented in this lecture and will be incorporated into the overview of the most important activities and contributions of the Organization of Musical Youth of Yugoslavia to the Yugoslav cultural, art and education spheres in its first 2 decades. I'd like to start with a short summary of the main characteristics of the post-Second World War Yugoslav cultural policy before 1974, particularly in the first decade after the end of war. Before the Communist Party of Yugoslavia formally came to power in February 1946, its officials, together with the leaders of several mass organizations oriented towards broader population, youth, workers and women, initiated various projects aiming at cultural enlightenment, particularly of, in Antonio Gramsci's terms, subaltern classes, which were due to historical, political, and economic circumstances before the war, excluded from the spheres of education, culture, as well as political and public spheres. The fact that large part of Yugoslav population did not have any chance to accumulate cultural capital, nor to become familiar with different aspects of scientific and technological development, and innovations in numerous domains of modern civilization was assumed essential in formulating of priorities in the so-called cultural educational work. This process was in the embryo stage during the war, owing to the activities in the free territories under the control of the People's Liberation Movement and Army, and by the end of 1944 and throughout 1945, it steadily expanded and evolved in terms of complexity. Given the close connections between the leaders of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia with its Soviet counterpart and Soviet Union since the late 1930s, the transfer of Soviet experiences, knowledge and policies was not surprising, and it continued in the aftermath of Second World War. As was the case with Soviets, Yugoslav cultural policy makers grounded their work particularly on Karl Marx's critique of the capitalist division of labor and the concept of omnilateral shaping of individuals and humankind through the process of self-actualization free from any limitations which is derived from it. Although it is not possible to go into details regarding Marx's views on these phenomena, his and Engels's often cited passage from German ideology could serve to clarify them. Man is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. Whereas in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have in mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. End of quotation. Another excerpt from Marx is also illustrative in this sense. I quote, "The exclusive concentration of artistic talent in particular individuals and its suppression in the broad mass which is bound up with this is a consequence of division of labor. In any case, with a communist organization of society, there disappears the subordination of the artist to local and national narrowness, which arises entirely from the division of labor, and also the subordination of the individual to some definite art, making him exclusively a painter, sculptor, etc. The very name amply expresses the narrowness of his professional development and his dependence on division of labor. In a communist society, there are no painters, but only people who engage in painting among other activities." End of quotation. There was an absence of theoretical elaboration of this segment of Marx's theory, which could be observed among Yugoslav cultural policymakers early after the war, although it obviously had a fundamental role in defining the aims and horizons of cultural educational work throughout the country. Instead of considering the specific characteristics of Yugoslav society and its cultural sphere when it comes to reducing inequalities of different kind, including the socio-cultural ones, as a reflection of omnilateralism and overcoming of involuntary division of labor, Yugoslav officials focused primarily on practical goals, such as encouraging the spread of activities aimed at cultural enlightenment of broad masses. This led mainly to the development of different types of literacy courses, evening schools, and educational programs for adults, but there were also attempts at enhancing aesthetic education among the large part of population. The importance of cultivating art appreciation, or more precisely, the ability to positively respond to artworks from different historical periods among particularly working class and peasants, was often emphasized in narratives of both Communist Party and various Yugoslav mass organizations. Unfortunately, as it was the case with the concept of cultural enlightenment, there were not many discussions about this topic, and therefore it is not surprising that thorough insights into the relevance and effects of developing sensibility for aesthetical dimensions of artworks, as well as a basic knowledge of history of different art disciplines among aforementioned social groups, was lacking. Except passing comments on the contribution of art to the omnilateral self-actualization or its generally civilizational role in the process of development of individuals, cultural policymakers at the time were not showing interest into giving detailed explanations on the place of aesthetic education in the project of cultural enlightenment of masses in post-World War Yugoslavia, its value, form, and possible emanations. Other than that, there was a great upsurge in the quantity and diversity of cultural educational activities focused on shaping art and music tastes of the masses and overcoming the barrier between them and art practices after the early 1945. For that purpose, numerous actors in the Yugoslav cultural sphere took different initiatives centered mostly on two objectives: to spread art amateurism among the larger part of Yugoslav population, taking into consideration socio-demographic distinctions among its different parts, and working separately with children, or as they were called, pioneers, youth, young workers, students, workers, inhabitants of rural areas, etc. And second, to enable these groups to have a regular contact with artworks through attending concerts, theatrical performances, and exhibitions. At first, establishing of cultural artistic societies with their choral, drama, and folk dance sections, and in later stages, orchestral ensembles and sections for photography and film, represented an absolute priority together with constructing a large network of facilities for cultural activities in urban and rural settings. Slowly but steadily, other forms of educational activities were complementing the spread of art amateurism. This was the slide that was meant to be presented, so these are just some visual examples. Okay. So the most consistent work in the domain of aesthetic education in the first post-war years was shown by Republican associations of writers, especially those in Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and to a lesser extent in Bosnia and Herzegovina. After the early 1946, the so-called group literary readings with several authors and the so-called also conferences of individual authors were introduced into cultural life of urban places across many Yugoslav republics. These types of events were based on the reading of excerpts from poems or literary works by Yugoslav authors themselves, the explaining of their poetical strivings and creative trajectories, as well as authors' interaction with the audience, mainly in the form of spontaneous dialogue. They were meant to let the writers, I quote, closely follow the audience's response to their work, together with its critical insights and suggestions through more intimate type of communication and interpretation, but they also represented a means to, I quote, overcome the barrier between people and culture and spread the culture among them, end of quotation. In the beginning, literary readings were limited to the main Yugoslav urban centers, but as soon as certain Republican associations became consolidated in organizational terms, the readings were frequently being held in provincial towns and rural places based on long-term thoughtful planning. The Association of Writers of the People's Republic of Serbia, for example, prepared an ambitious proposal of the several months-long tour of group of writers that encompassed visits to various towns, mining centers, factories, agricultural collectives, and the sites of public works, both in Serbia and its neighboring republics, for the summer and autumn of 1949. Regular reading sessions for the Yugoslavs living outside the capital cities were also organized at the time in Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Slovenia, and some events were specifically shaped for the secondary school students. The Writers' Association of Slovenia was particularly giving emphasis to thorough and continuous work with school children, which culminated in the early 1950s owing to bringing into fruition of dozens of literary readings in numerous towns and villages across different Slovenian regions, mostly in local schools. In 1952, they organized 12 reading sessions with children from elementary schools, but the next year, the number of such events rose to 53, and in 1954, it was surpassed already in the first months. According to the published reports, children in the smaller towns and villages across Slovenia were eagerly waiting to attend the readings, sometimes coming to the venue several hours before their start. They were giving bouquets of flowers to the writers and were attentively listening to them. Teachers claimed that these meetings were leaving lasting impressions on young listeners, inspiring them to read more of the Yugoslav literary production. Moreover, children's awakened interest in Yugoslav books was spreading out into their families as well. Unlike the process of popularization of Yugoslav writers and literature, and in general the creation of affinity toward quality books, which took a steady path early after the Second World War, the work on enhancing the knowledge of art music, domestic or international, among the Yugoslav broader masses, and particularly children and youth, in the first post-war decade, was marked with constant fluctuations. Some of the first steps when it comes to the People's Republic of Serbia were carried out in 1946 with a cycle of performances of operas, dramas and comedies created exclusively for students of the Belgrade University, and in the season of 1947-48 with the introduction of a cycle of popular symphonic concerts with short lectures and explanations for secondary school students. Regarding symphonic concerts that were organized by the Agency for Cultural and Artistic Events of the Serbian Ministry of Education, not only was the audience given a chance to hear talented Belgrade music performance, but it was also able to become acquainted with selected orchestral pieces of composers from different music epochs and parts of the world. Still, it was not until the early 1950s that a noticeable rise in the number of activities oriented towards cultivating the music taste, particularly of Yugoslav youth, and broadening of their knowledge of music history could be observed. From the series of lectures focused on topics from the history of art music, titled Musical Lectorium, organized by the Croatian Music Institute in 1950, to the regular concerts for youth of the leading Philharmonic Orchestra in the country, or the collective attending of performances of the National Theatre of Ljubljana's ensemble via special train lines meant for the population at the town's outskirts and peripheral settlements in 1954, what could not be disregarded was not only the diversity of cultural actors that started to contribute to the process of music and cultural emancipation of youth and broader population, but the methodology and overall approach they were applying as well. At the same time, Yugoslav cultural policymakers and music professionals were becoming more and more vocal about the failures of initiatives focused on popularization of art music to meet the expectations regarding the quantity of participating subjects, along with their motivation for advancing the knowledge on this type of music. For example, only in the first months of 1952, a dozen of articles appeared in the daily newspaper, actually, Borba, that have warned about the flood of bad, cheap and commercial music and other cultural products in Yugoslavia, and the negative effects they had on younger generations, their taste, cultural habits, behavior, etc. Other newspapers and periodicals also contributed to a kind of campaigning against the corruption of youth. Parallel to that, there were many complaints about the phenomenon of empty concert halls and the prevailing disinterest towards art music in the biggest Yugoslav urban centers. One of the most detailed analyses of mentioned phenomenon was offered by an influential Serbian composer and cultural worker, Mihajlo Dragović, who, among other things, made several important remarks. Dragović found that almost nothing has been done in the domain of audience development after the Second World War, and that it represented, I quote, one of the biggest failures in our post-war music culture, end of quotation, being certain in the existence of a large pool of potential concert goers, especially among children and youth. Instead of half-hearted engagement in music and aesthetic education by various institutions and organizations, which was shown in Belgrade's and Yugoslav musical life in this period, Dragović advocated for a systematic work with high school students, university students, and young workers through special concert symphonic cycles designed and shaped in accordance with their needs and knowledge and organized at least once a month. A prerequisite for adequate results in this field was the careful selection of repertoire on the ground of step-by-step introduction of more complex forms and avoidance of too long narrative explanations. Instead, youth should be let enjoy the art music and, I quote, become mesmerized by the power of its expressive tools, end of quotation. Dragović's prophetic words, expressed in the journal Književne novine, a literary journal, in 1952, found a strong echo 2 years later in the establishment of Society of Friends of Music in Zagreb and in Belgrade in March 1954, whose primary goal was to initiate a systematic and multi-directional work, mostly with children and youth, in order to make them better acquainted with art music history, to shape their music and art taste, and to give them the possibility to enjoy and understand artworks. The founding of these organizations took place in the period when important shifts were made in Yugoslav political and cultural life. Apart from the gradual implementation of the concept of self-management since the early 1950s and complete overthrow of agitprop policies and strategies by 1952, Yugoslav cultural sphere was under great influence of the following processes: making steps towards pacification and rapprochement with Eastern Bloc countries, and at the same time giving impetus to more abundant cultural exchange with the Western Bloc. The specific atmosphere that evolved in this sphere as a result of these changes was particularly conducive to thriving of organizations similar to Societies of Friends of Music, based on expert knowledge and approach to solving specific issues, and with a focus on overcoming various structural inequalities between centers and peripheries, more developed and less developed republics and provinces, urban and rural areas, and children and youth with different social background. Consequently, it is hardly surprising that these organizations were given financial support and assistance from cultural policymakers and professional circles early on, which undoubtedly contributed to their continuous development and broadening and diversification of programs and activities. In the first 5 years before societies on the territories of Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina were brought together in the federal organization named Coordination Board of the Musical Youth of Yugoslavia, their main emphasis was on the forms of aesthetic education that were extensively used in Yugoslav cultural and public spheres. These were subscription cycles that were grounded on series of the so-called stylistic concerts, whose task was to depict in sound the most important periods in the art music history: Baroque, Classicist, Romantic era, and certain 20th century currents with their leading orchestral and operatic composers and their masterpieces. They were introduced in Zagreb during the fall of 1954 and 2 years later in Belgrade as well. Since subscription cycles were very typical at the time for many music, media, and cultural institutions and ensembles, leading to their constant proliferation at the second half of the 1950s, it is hard to conclude whether Society of Friends of Music cycles managed to stand out or not. But what seemed indisputable was the fact that diversity of offer of concert cycles in the musical lives of many urban centers in Yugoslavia did not necessarily lead to positive outcomes. Or, as Belgrade-based composer and critic Dusan Kostić remarked, it is not reasonable to create subscription cycles where 1 or 2 world-known soloists would be announced and would serve to attract the audience, especially if they cancel the concert afterwards. Moreover, this practice could demotivate potential listeners in the long run. Aside from that, the inflow of diverse cycles did not give an opportunity to the audience to follow all of them, but instead to choose some of the cycles and at the same time discard the others. One of the most important factors that shaped the functioning of the Societies of Friends of Music and the musical youth organizations after 1959 and during the following 2 decades was the introducing of thoroughly reformed educational system in Yugoslavia, from preschool level to the university level, that among other things included the redefining of the form, content and desired results of the music curricula, particularly in elementary schools. This encompassed the revisions regarding the role of music teachers, not only in schools, but in local musical life as well, and accordingly the development of stronger ties between educational and cultural institutions. The insisting on larger social engagement of schools and their employees, especially those that were oriented to aesthetic education, opened a new space for different types of organizations devoted to children and youth. The officials of Musical Youth of Yugoslavia and its Republican branches recognized the potentials that resulted from this reform and responded with a set of educational formats specifically created for the school environment. One of such formats, the thematic concerts, soon became the most popular part of its programs and, in a way, its trademark. They were appearing in 2 forms, one based on music pieces and the other grounded on synthesis of mainly poetry, literary works and music, and sometimes dance and visual art. The thematic concerts became a norm in the Republican and local communities branches of musical youth during the 1960s and 1970s, and they created a space for experimenting with selected subjects and repertoires while taking care of audiences' age and level of music education, along with their needs and dispositions. Based on a handful of reviews of such events in the first years after they were introduced, the youngest school children responded to them positively with a lot of excitement and joy. One of the very popular thematic concerts in this period among Belgrade school children was the one titled Musical Program for the Youth, which was grounded on compositions of Mozart, Schubert and Schumann, popular songs for children from the competition Children Are Singing, or Deca Pevaju, as well as poems for children of Milovan Mića Danilić, Serbian writer and poet, which were performed by the soloists of Belgrade Opera, actors of the theater Atelje 212, and Radio Belgrade's music professionals. Another successful example was the thematic concert titled Animals in Music, which was performed in schools across Zagreb center and periphery in 1960. It encompassed programmatic works of Louis-Claude Daquin, Schumann, Schubert, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Saint-Saëns, Sviatoslav Lesinski, and Bruno Bielinski. As reported by Branka Lalić, official of the Musical Youth of Zagreb at the time, children who attended these concerts were, I quote, having wonderful time, they were applauding, recognizing the animals depicted by music means, laughing to their adventures, and were enchanted with their fate. End of quotation. Other thematic concerts that attracted a lot of attention of school children, primarily in Zagreb and Belgrade, but also of urban places around People's Republic of Croatia and Serbia by the mid-1960s were the following. Operatic music of Bedřich Smetana and Jakov Gotovac. Your first concert, this was meant for children between 8 and 12 years, with pieces of Chopin, Dussek, Schumann, Wieniawski, Gossek, Mozart, Dvorak, Brahms, and Srđan Barić, and also What is Music, which contained excerpts from Mussorgsky's pictures from the exhibition and fragments from Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. While the variety and quantity of the solely musical, but also synthetical thematic concerts was in the constant rise in the Republican branches of musical youth, especially in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the following tasks were given a great significance. First, to diversify the offerings of these concerts and concert cycles as much as possible, while respecting the distinctions between subgroups of children and youth, which depended on their age, maturity, socio-cultural background, etc. Second, to broaden the music repertoire by including more works of Yugoslav and contemporary composers. And 3, to work on educating the conferenciers or animators through special seminars. After mid-1960s, there was a tendency to create more thematic concerts per each season or per subsequent seasons, especially for the youngest generations of school children, which were 8 to 12 years old, in the Republican framework, and by the mid-1970s, the increased interest was shown in a systematic work with preschoolers. For example, there were at least 9 different thematic concerts, musical, poetical, or only musical, for children in elementary schools on the programs of Musical Youth of Belgrade and Serbia for several seasons at the turn of the 1960s and 1970s. Not only it was important to periodically broaden the selection of such concerts to evade the risk of making programs monotonous and in a certain way outdated, but it was also fundamental to complement them with other types of events and performances. The combining of thematic concerts with other concert or educational forms was a long-standing practice within this organization, which gradually evolved into carefully planned cycles for schools and members of musical youth in urban centers across Yugoslav republics and autonomous provinces. As a result of efforts of the Chief Committee of the Musical Youth of Yugoslavia, a cycle of concerts with many variants was prepared for various Yugoslav towns in the season of 1966-67. It was based mainly on the inter-republican and international cultural exchange, and depending on the capacities of central national theaters, was meant to be supplemented with performances of operatic, dramatic, or ballet pieces. This model was implemented by organizations' Republican branches by the end of the 1960s, and it contributed to its further elaboration and advancement. For instance, Serbian branch organized subscription cycles for children from 7 to 10 years, for pioneers 11 to 40 years, and youth above 14 years of age in 8 urban centers, including Belgrade, each of which contained 3 to 8 music or other events. So I will just let you take a look at these slides because these are examples from the musical youth of Serbia. This is how it looked like one season in each town. I just selected several towns, not the all that were included. Based on journal reports from schools that were located in Yugoslav urban centers, musical youth school concerts were received with positive responses both of school children and music teachers. Short surveys that were published in Belgrade-based magazine Pro Muzika in the 1970s and in other sources were revealing the plurality of contributions of such concerts. For example, music teacher at the Belgrade Elementary School, Bratstvo i Jedinstvo, emphasized that this school cooperated with musical youth since 1964 and that their help was, I quote, of immense importance, while her colleague from the school, Đuro Strugar, pointed out that all the programs of these organizations were, I quote, skillfully created, end of quotation, that children were fascinated by them, which further strengthened their interest in music during the classes of music education and also out of school, through self-initiated visits of opera houses and concert halls. Other teachers from Belgrade underlined the correlation between concerts of musical youth and school curriculum, as well as the fact that these concerts were the best, I quote, complementary to classes, since school's gramophone records were known to pupils, while live performances and direct contact with artists left indelible mark on them, end of quotation. Apart from that, many teachers claimed that cooperation with the musical youth organization was a real pleasure for school children, that they were impatiently waiting for their turn for school concerts that were held once a month, and they were very excited to welcome art music performance in their schools. Despite generally affirmative reports that were coming from the field, From the late 1960s onwards, there were critical voices inside Republican and federal musical youth organizations that highlighted the necessity to strongly reshape the program for children and youth, to reconsider the relations with cultural institutions, and to pay more attention to young workers and young population from rural areas. Very interesting discussion regarding these topics was planned to take place during the meeting of activists of musical youth in February 1968. The draft prepared for that meeting contained many critical observations and, in a certain way, prompted questioning of some of the dominant policies of this organization, including the idea to foster closer ties between youth and valuable art, to introduce art music to children via step-by-step approach, to offer synthetical thematic concerts as a more communicative and interactive form for young school children, to advocate the belief that only good, authentic and valuable music should be performed, etc. So I quote, in musical youth we are talking about for years about program as a very well-known part of our efforts to bring young people closer to valuable art. Does our practice confirm this selfish assumption? Who is creating our programs, us or the external factors? What do we assume by a valuable artwork? Which is the basic element of our programs? Are continuity and gradual progress embedded in our programs? Why are we using the synthesis of arts? Out of weakness or because we're convinced that it is an appropriate path? If it is, which type of synthesis we find adequate? It is known that we can classify music in different ways, not only on good and bad. Is our attitude one-sided and can we change it? What is the role of program committees? How much of our minimal program created by committee is really actualized in practice? End of quotation. Coincidentally or not, these reforming impulses were brought to the surface just several months before the Students' Rebellion in Belgrade, Zagreb and Sarajevo in June 1968, that for the first time openly articulated a deep-seated discontent with the circumstances in Yugoslav society at the time. They were paralleled with demands for more systematic work with young workers and children and youth from rural places that appeared in the most influential local and Republican organizations. For instance, in the early 1967, Musical Youth of Belgrade discussed about the initiation of regular concert cycles for young workers and students of vocational schools in factories or dormitories that slowly evolved into a well-planned series of approximately 12 concerts per season for each factory and dormitory with a hybrid repertoire. The problem of creating adequate approach to these categories of youth was since that period addressed more often, which culminated in November 1974 when the second conference of musical youth took place. It was devoted exclusively to the issue of shaping of programs and working on aesthetical education of the mentioned categories. The discussions at this conference stressed for the first time the phenomenon of certain structural limitations immanent to Yugoslav society that prevented the impact of musical youth organizations and their programs on youth coming from rural areas and working class families. For instance, delegates from Zagreb-based organization, after many years-long involvement with youth from such background, came to some very important insights, such as the one that this part of population showed a lack of aesthetic education and dispositions for appropriating and understanding aesthetic values due to family circumstances and lifestyle, or that the existing cultural life grounded on bourgeois models and institutions did not correspond to their habits and views. In addition, Zagreb musical youth officials pointed out to the problem of social inequalities in Yugoslav society and the fact that they were being reproduced in cultural life owing to its way of functioning, its hierarchies and strongly rooted boundaries. This claim supported the assumptions and views of not only rebellious students, but the whole countercultural scene that was crystallized after the mid-1960s and into the early 1970s, with an emphasis on the search for more democratic, participatory and just Yugoslav society without deep socioeconomic and cultural divisions. Unlike these actors, and in accordance with the post-1974 constitution atmosphere, musical youth officials did not delve into their observations, focusing instead on practical solutions. In this case, the attempts to develop special programs for young workers and youth from rural areas. There were many attempts to work in continuation on the aesthetic education and cultivation of music tastes of Yugoslav broader masses, particularly the youth, in the first post-war decade, many of which usually could not survive one whole season. Yugoslav youth and students' organizations, together with Republican associations of art, music, performance, were among the most agile cultural actors in this regard. Also, certain Republican concert agencies and philharmonic orchestras were trying to create special educational programs for youth. Still, it was not until the establishment of societies of Friends of Music in Zagreb and Belgrade and the Musical Youth of Yugoslavia that the process of overcoming the barrier between art, music, and Yugoslav children and youth was given firmer grounding. Moreover, as these organizations gained professional recognition, other actors in this domain, specifically the music associations and mass organizations, not only started to support them financially and in other ways, but they also handed them over the care for children and youth's aesthetic and music education. With a strong public approval concerning their mission in Yugoslav musical and cultural life, officials of musical youth made every effort to justify the trust bestowed upon them. Trying to create a lasting impact on Yugoslav children and youth and turn them into genuine admirers of valuable music and art, leaders and activists of this organization struggled to overcome various structural obstacles in Yugoslav cultural sphere and in the sphere of education. Owing to their work, school halls were transformed into concert venues, and the young population from the urban outskirts, rural areas and provincial regions had a chance to come into contact with completely unfamiliar sound of art music. The establishment of musical youth undoubtedly brought into Yugoslav musical and cultural life a more systematic work with children and youth in the domain of aesthetic and music education and revolutionized it in many aspects. It is owing to this organization that cultural institutions, schools, and music professionals were brought together for the first time, and that promotion of collaboration between different mediators of cultural, artistic, and educational policies was given a priority. Also worth mentioning was a dedicated work of musical youth officials on cultural decentralization, as well as their efforts to counter conservative approach to repertoire policies of Yugoslav cultural and music institutions. Even though musical youth had an impact on a modest number of children and youth, those segments of young Yugoslavs that were encompassed through its activities had an opportunity to enjoy a continuous contact with music art world, to develop new habits and interests, and broaden their cultural horizons. Thank you very much for your attention.